The wind scoured the high ridges of Montana like a rasp, hissing through pine needles until the forest itself seemed to whisper warnings. Snow smothered the rough-hewn cabins of the miners' camp, burying roofs, blurring paths, and pressing against the windows with the weight of silence. In that silence, 6 men huddled around a dwindling fire, their shadows long and skeletal against log walls. By the winter of 1874, they were trapped 70 miles from Bannack, cut off by storms that turned every trail into a white tomb. The men had come in search of gold veins rumored to lie in the gulches near the Little Blackfoot River. Instead, they found only hunger. Their story mattered because it stripped away every illusion about the frontier. It asked a question few dared speak. How thin is the line between civilization and savagery when survival is at stake? The camp itself seemed to breathe misery. The air smelled of wet wool and smoke, undercut by the acrid tang of boiled pine needles, poor substitute for food. Timber groaned in the cold, and the floorboards underfoot were hard with frost. The texture of every surface reminded them of scarcity. Blankets stiff as boards, bread sacks empty but still folded neatly, waiting for a miracle. 6 companions, 1 winter, no food. They had once dreamed of striking it rich, of taking wagons heavy with ore back east. But December snow erased those dreams as quickly as it buried their trails. Supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. They chewed rawhide straps until their jaws ached. They boiled pine bark, sipping the bitter broth like it was salvation. When tobacco ran out, some crumbled pine cones into their pipes for the illusion of smoke. Their bellies turned inward, gnawing at themselves. By Christmas Eve, a storm sealed them in completely. The white wall outside their cabin doors cut off hope of hunting or foraging. For days, the men endured in silence, only the crackle of wood punctuating the groans of empty stomachs. They began to watch one another differently, not as comrades, but as potential lifelines. In a battered notebook later retrieved from the ruins, a miner scrawled by candle stub, December 28, 1874. We are near perishing, snow still falling. Our bellies claw us like wolves. No meat, no bread, no hope. That line, our bellies claw us like wolves, haunted investigators long after. Hunger had become not a condition, but a predator crouching inside them, waiting to tear loose. And then came the first collapse. A man slumped by the fire, lips blue, breath rattling like coals before they wink out. The others stared. No one moved at first, paralyzed by fear of what they were already thinking. One body on the floor meant one choice too terrible to voice. But hunger is louder than conscience. The stakes were no longer survival versus dignity. They were survival versus death. Frontier society could forgive a man for freezing. It could even forgive a man for failing to strike gold. But could it forgive a man for eating another? The cabin smelled of pine smoke, sweat, and something new, the stillness of death. Outside, snow muffled all sound. Inside, 5 pairs of eyes studied the unmoving figure, and each man wrestled with the same question. What would you have done? Would you have crossed that line? Or would you have chosen to starve, preserving honor but surrendering breath? Someone in that room broke first. Whether it was with a knife or with nothing more than trembling hands, history refuses to say. But once the silence cracked, there was no mending it. And once hunger was fed, there was no undoing what had been done. By the first week of January, tracks appeared in the snow, spotted by trappers passing near the gulch. 5 sets of prints staggered away from the camp, heading down canyon toward Deer Lodge. 1 set was missing. 5 gone. 1 remained. When Sheriff Henry Hardin heard of the survivor, he rode out himself. He knew before he arrived that the man's tale would never match the evidence, the footprints, the weather, the absence of food. He suspected what the community would soon whisper aloud. This was not just a story of starvation. This was a story of men who had turned on one another. But which man lived? And what had truly happened in that frozen cabin where hunger became stronger than friendship? The answers would stagger the Montana Territory, ripple through frontier newspapers, and leave a stain that no amount of gold could ever wash away. The storm lifted just enough in early January to reveal what the snow had been hiding. A trail leading down from the gulch, 5 men moving together, one conspicuously absent. Their shapes were barely visible against the endless white hunched beneath ragged coats stiff with ice. They carried nothing but rifles and sacks that sagged light. No pack animals, no provisions, only shadows in the snow. The stakes had shifted. This was no longer just survival, it was secrecy. Because when 6 men go into the wilderness and only 5 emerge, questions hang in the air like frost. Questions with answers that could destroy reputations or lives. Deer Lodge in 1874 was a town that smelled of coal smoke, horse sweat, and whiskey. Saloons rattled with piano music and drunken laughter. But beneath it all ran an undercurrent of suspicion. Every newcomer was studied, every story measured against hard frontier experience. When the 5 miners stumbled in, frostbitten and hollow-eyed, the townsfolk listened to their account with careful ears. They claimed their companion had frozen, nothing more. "Starvation took him," one man muttered. "We buried him decent." Yet their faces told a different story. Their eyes skittered away from direct questions. Their cheeks hollowed not merely from hunger, but from something unspoken pressing against their ribs. A local shopkeeper later remembered how the survivors devoured food the instant it was set before them. Meat pies, bread, stew stuffed down so fast it seemed less like eating than erasing. But the townspeople also noticed details that didn't fit. Their rifles had fresh grease, though they swore they hadn't fired a shot in weeks. Their boots were scrubbed too clean, as if someone had worked to hide what clung to the leather. One miner carried a notebook, its pages carefully folded shut. He claimed it belonged to their lost companion. He wouldn't let it leave his hands. In the courthouse records, a single line appears from a hearing dated January 12th. Survivors refuse consistent testimony. One name offered, then contradicted. Judge orders further inquiry. The inquiry deepened suspicions. How had 5 men endured weeks of starvation, storms, without more deaths? Why were their cheeks less gaunt than expected? And most damning of all, why did the footprints outside the gulch cabin tell of 6 men leaving together, not 5 leaving one behind? Silence became their only shield. When pressed, they repeated the same phrases. "We lost him. He froze. We buried him." But silence, repeated too often, begins to sound like guilt. Imagine the room where they huddled in Deer Lodge, whispering among themselves, fire popping, whiskey bottles half empty, the air thick with sweat and fear. Did they make a pact then to hold the same story, to never admit what happened in that frozen cabin? Or was one man already planning to betray the rest, to save himself at their expense? Because betrayals always come. By mid-January, rumors spread across the territory faster than any official report. Prospectors in Helena and Butte repeated whispers of the cannibal miners. Newspapers hinted at unspeakable acts, though they lacked proof. Each retelling grew sharper, darker, until the story took on a life of its own. The dread sharpened into a single phrase. They ate their own. What would you have done, sitting in that courtroom, as the miners shuffled in, their boots scraping wood, their faces half hidden under hats? Would you have believed their oaths of innocence? Or would you have believed the silence, louder than words, that hung between them? The sheriff pressed harder. Witnesses were called. The snowbound trail was retraced. And soon enough, the fragile pact the miners had built began to crack, one voice at a time. Because when survival turns to secrecy, secrecy always turns to betrayal. And the first betrayal would not only unravel their story, It would unleash a confession so chilling that Montana would never forget the winter of death. It began with a single slip of the tongue, barely noticed at first. One miner, his hand shaking as he held a cup of coffee, let fall a detail that hadn't appeared in their earlier testimonies. "We drew lots." The words clattered into the silence of the saloon like a dropped knife. Men at nearby tables froze mid-drink. The sheriff, seated in the corner, raised his head slowly. A reminder of the stakes hung heavy. This was no longer about mere survival. It was about the law. If one of them admitted to drawing lots, to planning who lived and who died, then it was no longer accident or misfortune. It was murder, and perhaps worse. The room itself seemed to lean in. Coal smoke curled from the stove, thick as secrets. The sharp tang of whiskey lingered in the air. Wooden floorboards were sticky underfoot, scuffed by boots restless with anticipation. The miner realized too late what he'd said, tried to backtrack, muttering about cards, about chance, about just talk. But the sheriff's ears were sharp, and the town's thirst for scandal sharper still. Later that night, in the small, drafty cell behind the courthouse, the same miner cracked. His voice echoed against stone walls, damp with frost. He spoke in halting bursts, each word heavier than the last. "We couldn't go on. One of us had to fall." He drew the short straw. "We did what we must. God forgive us." The sheriff recorded it in his ledger, January 16th, 1874. Those words turned whispers into certainty. The miners had not only buried a companion, they had consumed him. The confession spread like fire on dry grass. In Helena, a newspaper headline screamed, "Cannibalism in the Rockies miners feed upon companion." In Butte, saloon patrons passed the story from mouth to mouth, each embellishing details until the miners were painted as ghouls. And in Deer Lodge, townsfolk began avoiding the men entirely, stepping aside in the street, crossing themselves under their breath. What would you have done, hearing that confession in the sheriff's office, watching a man sob into his hands as he admitted to feasting on flesh to survive? Would you have pitied him? Or would you have felt the stirrings of disgust, even fear, as though something monstrous had entered your town? The confession fractured the group. The others, furious at their companion's weakness, insisted he lied. They claimed he was mad from hunger, imagining horrors that never occurred. They swore again that the sixth man had simply frozen, buried in snow like so many nameless travelers. But the damage was done. Trust had cracked. And through that crack poured suspicion, rumor, and dread. The town held its breath as a formal inquiry was convened. Inside the courthouse, lamps hissed with burning oil, casting sharp shadows against plaster walls. The smell of wet wool and unwashed bodies clung to the air. Outside, townsfolk gathered, their whispers forming a constant low hum. Each miner was called in turn. Each offered a story that contradicted the last. One said the sixth man slipped on ice and struck his head. Another claimed he wandered into the storm and vanished. A third muttered only of desperate measures, his eyes fixed on the floor. And then came the question no one wanted to ask, but everyone needed answered. What became of the body? Silence stretched. The stove clanked as iron settled. Snow melted from boots into puddles that spread like stains. And finally, the first miner, shaking, sweating, his words nearly swallowed by the room, spoke again. "We took what we had to. We cut strips. We lived because of him. 5 men alive, 1 man gone. The truth, now undeniable." But the law demanded more than whispers. The law demanded names, details, and proof. Who had been chosen? How had the lot been drawn? And most chilling of all, had it truly ended with 1 man, or were there more victims hidden by snowdrifts? The inquiry adjourned with no verdict, only more questions. The miners were not yet charged, but their reputations were ruined. Strangers eyed them like beasts loosed from cages. Parents pulled children close when they passed. The sheriff himself admitted privately that while he had no gallows yet for cannibalism, the people may build one of their own. And in the shadow of that confession, one question clawed at every heart. If desperation can drive men to such an act once, what would stop it from happening again? The winter of death had claimed one body, but rumor whispered it might not stop there. Because behind closed doors, whispers suggested the miners' journey back to Deer Lodge had not been so simple. Tracks in the snow had shown 6 men leaving the gulch together, not 5. So where, then, had the 6th truly fallen? The answer to that question would lead investigators deeper into the mountains, where frozen silence held secrets darker than any confession. Snow still clung to the ridges when Sheriff Hardin assembled a small party to retrace the miners' path. Hooves crunched over ice, breath of horses steaming white against pine trunks. The sound was muted, swallowed by endless drifts. The smell of pitch and damp wool filled the air, while leather reins froze stiff in men's gloved hands. They followed faint depressions in the snow boot tracks, half melted, frozen again, ghostly impressions of men staggering toward Deer Lodge. The stakes pressed sharper with every mile. If the miners had lied, then proof lay waiting in the gulch. Proof of murder, proof of cannibalism. And if bodies were found, the law would need to decide whether hunger excused horror or whether the hangman's rope must. For 2 days, the searchers wound through canyons where icicles hung like spears from rock faces. At night, campfires crackled low, smoke clinging heavy in their blankets. Hardin wrote a note on January 22nd, his pencil scratching in the dim lantern glow. Rumors now certain. 5 men living where 6 set out. The hills keep the truth buried. We must dig it out. On the 3rd morning, they reached the miners' abandoned cabin. Silence hung inside like a second skin. The stove sat cold, its iron belly gaping open. Blankets were strewn across bunks, stiff as boards. And on the floor, dark stains marked the wood stains that no amount of melted snow could scrub away. Hardin knelt, running calloused fingers across the grain. The texture was rough, sticky, even beneath frost. The sheriff said nothing, but the others exchanged glances heavy with understanding. Something had been cut here, something more than firewood. Behind the cabin, they found the burial site, a shallow mound beneath twisted pine boughs, snow heaped high as if the mountain itself sought to cover what lay beneath. With numb hands and shovels clanging against frozen soil, they dug. The smell hit first sweet, metallic, unmistakable. Then came a boot sole, then bone, and then the partial remains of a man, or what was left of him. The corpse showed cuts clean as a butcher's knife, flesh pared away in strips, limbs reduced not by decay, but by deliberate carving. The head tilted back, jaw open, as though in a final, silent scream. The deputies recoiled. One crossed himself, another spat into the snow. Hardin alone kept still, jaw clenched, eyes steady. God help them, someone whispered. Or perhaps God damn them. The discovery turned whispers into evidence. It was no longer rumor. It was fact. The miners had not merely survived. They had survived by feeding upon their companion. The corpse gave mute testimony no confession could deny. But whose body was it? The records of names had grown tangled aliases, half-spelled signatures in ledgers. The dead man's identity mattered less to the searchers than the truth his bones carried, that the survivor's pact was broken. What would you have done, standing in that clearing, the wind carrying pine resin and decay in equal measure? Would you have covered the grave again, letting snow and silence reclaim it? Or would you have carried those bones to town as proof, risking that their sight might haunt you forever? Hardin chose a middle road. He ordered the remains reburied, but carefully noted every detail. The stripped muscles, the cuts, the absence of organs. He carried back only the man's boots, and a strip of fabric from his coat. That would be evidence enough. As the searchers turned their horses homeward, a question gnawed louder than the wind. The tracks had shown 6 men leaving the gulch together, not 5. Had there been another victim along the trail? Another grave hidden beneath miles of snow? At camp that night, around a thin fire sputtering in the wind, Hardin voiced it aloud. If this man was eaten, what stopped them from taking another before reaching town? No one answered. The fire hissed. Beyond the circle of light, the forest stretched endless and dark. The winter of death. The phrase became truth on their tongues. When Hardin returned to Deer Lodge with news, the town erupted. Saloons fell silent. Newspapers rushed to print lurid lines. Man butchered for sustenance, companions fed on flesh. Crowds gathered at the courthouse steps, demanding justice, demanding blood. The miners were arrested on charges of murder, though none could agree whose hand had struck the first blow. The 5 survivors sat in cells that reeked of damp stone and old tobacco smoke. They said little now. Some prayed. Some stared blankly at walls. One sang hymns under his breath until the guards begged him to stop. And in that silence, something darker brewed, because though Hardin had found one body, the snow still concealed more secrets. Whispers grew that other graves lay scattered along the miners' trail, that more men had been fed upon before the party reached Deer Lodge. And if that were true, then the horror was not one act of desperation, it was a pattern. By February, pressure mounted for a full trial. Witnesses were summoned, evidence gathered, and the men who had once come west for gold now faced the gallows instead. But one of them would break before the noose ever tightened. One of them would speak again, this time with a story so chilling it made the sheriff's first discovery look almost merciful. Because the winter of death had not yet revealed its darkest chapter, the trial convened in late February, inside a courthouse that smelled of lamp oil, damp wool, and fear. Wooden benches groaned under the weight of townsfolk packed shoulder to shoulder, breath fogging the air in the bitter cold. A single iron stove rattled in the corner, heat doing little against the chill that seemed to seep up from the very floorboards. The miners, gaunt but no longer starving, sat at a long table. Their eyes flicked toward one another but never held. Each man seemed to carry a private terror. The stakes could not have been higher. If the court accepted their story, that one companion died naturally and consumed only after death, they might face disgrace, but escape the gallows. But if testimony suggested murder, if proof hinted at more than one victim, then the men would not walk free. They would hang. Judge Conger presided, his gavel a heavy punctuation in the charged air. Witnesses were called. Shopkeepers testified about the miners' strange return to town, about boots too clean, rifles suspiciously oiled. The sheriff recounted the grave he'd uncovered near the gulch, his voice steady but grim. Each word painted the picture darker. And then came the moment that changed everything. One of the miners, the same man who had first confessed in whispers, stood to speak again. His face was pale, lips trembling as though each word cost him dearly. The crowd leaned forward, the creak of benches echoing like a drum roll. He began slowly, voice breaking. It weren't just one. There was another, maybe more. Gasps rippled through the room. The judge rapped his gavel for silence, but the air was already electric. The miner swallowed hard and continued. We left the gulch together, 6 of us, but the snow took its toll. The weakest fell first. We told ourselves it was mercy, that we only took what the Lord had already taken. But hunger makes liars of men. Hunger makes beasts. The words hung like frost. He described how they had drawn lots again as the blizzard worsened. How one man begged for his life, promising to carry on, swearing he still had strength. How his pleas were swallowed by the storm and by the resolve of the others. The confession poured out in jagged bursts, like a dam finally splitting. We carved him where he lay, took strips enough to keep walking. We told ourselves we'd only done what was needful, but his eyes followed me, even after. The courtroom sat in stunned silence, broken only by the muffled sob of a woman in the gallery. Outside, the wind rattled shutters, as though the mountains themselves echoed his words. What would you have done? Sitting there, listening to a man confess not to survival, but to choice. Would you have seen him as a victim of winter, or as a murderer cloaked in necessity? The miner's tale spiraled darker. He claimed that by the time they reached Deer Lodge, only luck, or fate, had spared the rest. They had all thought of killing again, he said, but the sight of town lights stayed their hands. Hunger had receded, replaced by fear of discovery. We might have turned on each other, he muttered, if the storm had lasted one day longer. 5 survivors, 2 bodies gone, one story too terrible to contain. The judge ordered the testimony recorded in full, ink scratching fast across parchment. The sheriff clenched his jaw, knowing this confession would ignite outrage beyond control. Already the townsfolk muttered, whispers swelling into fury. Murderers, some spat. Monsters. The defense tried to argue desperation, pointing to history, the Donner Party, the Sierra Snowbound who had done the same. But this was no California legend. This was Montana, and the dead lay within their own county. Familiar faces, carved, consumed, discarded. The jury listened, stone-faced, their expressions unreadable. At night, the prisoners lay awake in their cells, listening to townsfolk gather outside. Voices rose in anger, stones clattering against barred windows. One guard overheard a miner whisper, "The dead are with us still. I hear them scratching at the door." The survivor's tale spread through newspapers like wildfire. From Helena to Chicago, headlines screamed, "Cannibals in the Rockies." Illustrations showed miners crouched over fallen companions, knives flashing, snow swirling. The more the story spread, the less the truth mattered. The men had become symbols of hunger, of horror, of the thin line that separated humanity from savagery. But within that courtroom, the truth grew knottier still, because questions remained. Whose bodies had been consumed? Were there truly only 2? And if lots had been drawn, who wielded the knife? The miner who confessed broke down completely, sobbing into his hands. He begged forgiveness from God, from the families of the dead, from anyone who might still believe in his humanity. But the others at the table glared at him with hatred. His confession had doomed them all. Their pact was shattered, their silence destroyed. What would you have done if you were one of the others? Would you have broken with him, calling him a liar to save yourself? Or would you have joined him, unburdening your soul, even if it meant the rope? The trial dragged on, each day colder than the last. Witnesses contradicted one another, records blurred. The snow outside piled deeper, as though the mountains sought to remind the town of the desperation that had birthed this horror. But the miner's story no longer belonged to them. It belonged to rumor, to ink, to fear, and the fear only grew when another discovery was made in the mountains, a discovery that suggested the survivor's tale still did not contain the full measure of truth. March brought thaw along the Little Blackfoot River. Snowmelt hissed through gullies, water cutting channels beneath drifts that had hidden sins for months. It was there that trappers found the first sign, a boot sole protruding from a bank of ice, leather-swollen stitching burst. The smell reached them before their knives, freed the body a sour, metallic stench of rot, unsoftened even by mountain air. They rode straight to Deer Lodge with news. The stakes now turned fatal for the survivors. If one body was misfortune and 2 were desperation, a third meant something far darker, a pattern of killing, not just starvation. The court could not dismiss coincidence once multiple graves spoke the same story. Sheriff Hardin rode with deputies to recover the corpse. The trail smelled of wet pine and thawing earth, the texture of ground spongy under hooves. Along a cut bank shaded by firs, they dug out what thaw had already revealed. A man half buried, ribs cleanly stripped, limbs missing flesh. The face was almost unrecognizable, but the cuts told everything. Knife marks scored bone. Joints had been neatly severed. Hardin's hand trembled as he wrote the date in his log. March 5th, 1874. Third victim confirmed. Evidence beyond denial. The body was carried back on a sled, covered with canvas that did little to mask its horror. In Deer Lodge, crowds gathered as the sled rattled over frozen ruts. Mothers clutched children close. Men muttered curses. By the time it reached the courthouse, fury boiled hotter than law could contain. Inside, the corpse lay in a crude wooden box, the smell filling every crevice of the room. Doctors examined the remains, noting precise incisions, flesh removed in deliberate strips. This was no accident. This was butchery. What would you have done if you stood there, watching sober men shake their heads over that box? Would you have demanded justice on the spot, or would you have forced yourself to listen to the trial, even as your stomach churned at the evidence laid bare? The miners were hauled from their cells to view the body, their faces drained white. One swore aloud that he had never seen the man before. Another spat, "This is a trick, a lie." But their words rang hollow against the stink of proof. The courtroom swelled beyond capacity, benches crammed, windows fogged. Outside, the square filled with townsfolk, too restless to work, waiting for verdicts not yet spoken. Lamp smoke and sweat thickened the air until breathing itself felt like wading through truth too heavy to bear. And then the doctor spoke plainly. This man was consumed. The phrase echoed like thunder. From that moment, the case shifted. The miners were no longer framed as desperate men surviving hardship. They were painted as predators. The jury stiffened. The judge's gavel cracked louder. And the newspapers, hungry for spectacle, feasted. Helena's Independent ran a headline 2 days later. Third grave unearthed cannibals roam Montana hills. Chicago papers picked it up within a week. By then, the miners' names were known from Missouri to New York. They were no longer faceless prospectors. They were symbols of the frontier's darkest edge. But proof raised new questions. If 3 victims were found, why had 5 men survived? Whose bodies were missing? And most chilling of all, had the men consumed only those who died naturally, or had they hastened death to feed their hunger? The survivor, who had already confessed, sat mute now, eyes hollow. His cellmate claimed he whispered in sleep, words chilling as any testimony. The eyes watched me still. We left them open. Guards swore he woke screaming, clawing at shadows only he could see. The townsfolk whispered another name for the gulch. Not Little Blackfoot, but Hollow Stomach Canyon. Children dared each other to walk its edge, promising to listen for the dead, calling from under the snow. Yet the trial dragged on, law wrestling with horror. Evidence proved the men had consumed flesh, but intent remained murky. Could desperation erase guilt? Could starvation excuse murder? The miner's lawyer argued history again. He cited the Donner Party, explorers frozen in the Arctic, sailors stranded at sea. He insisted no man could judge another who had never faced such hunger. But the crowd hissed. Montana was not California. These victims were not faceless strangers. They had names, families, graves that townsfolk might pass on Sundays. The winter of death. The words rang through every hallway. Hardin himself admitted privately that the evidence might never reveal the full truth. Tracks had been swallowed by storms, bodies scattered by thaw. How many graves remained hidden beneath Montana's snow? How many companions had vanished without record, known only by the stomachs of their peers? What would you have done? Sheriff Hardin wondered as he stared at the third grave. If you stood in their boots, wind knifing your face, belly gnawing itself hollow. Would you have waited for death, or drawn steel against a comrade? The miner's fate now hinged on more than law. It hinged on how much horror a community could bear before it demanded retribution. The jury was not only weighing evidence, they were weighing fear. And fear, once stirred, rarely sleeps again. By the end of March, word reached Deer Lodge that still more bones had been sighted near the gulch. Hunters claimed coyotes had dragged them into the open. Whether rumor or fact, the effect was the same. Panic hardened into certainty. The survivors were not just desperate men. They were killers, hiding behind hunger. The trial neared its climax. Witnesses lined up, crowds swelled, and in the cells below, the miners waited, shadows lengthening across their faces, knowing that each new discovery sealed their doom tighter. But the darkest revelation had not yet surfaced, because among the scattered bones, investigators would soon find an object more damning than flesh alone, an object that carried names, dates, and details no one could ignore. April thaw loosened more than rivers. It loosened secrets. Near the miner's gulch, a deputy searching among splintered timbers of the abandoned cabin found a leather pouch tucked beneath floorboards. The pouch smelled of mildew and smoke, the texture cracked, stiff from months of frost. Inside was a small notebook, its pages warped, ink blurred in places but still legible, the stakes sharpened with every line. For within those pages lay more than stray notes. It was a ledger, a grim tally of names, days, and marks beside each. Marks that seemed to indicate not just who had fallen, but how. Sheriff Hardin read aloud in his office, voice flat as he turned the pages. December 27th, John Week, coughing, drew the lot. A pause. The deputies exchanged glances. Another line followed. January 2nd, Thomas quarreled over scraps, ended it. Each name ended with the same crude notation, a slash, then a single word. Taken. What would you have done? Standing there as those words echoed in that cold office, lamp smoke clinging to your clothes. Would you have believed it, the ravings of a starving mind? Or would you have accepted the ink as proof, binding as any noose? The ledger was carried into the courtroom days later. Its arrival was electric. Townsfolk pressed shoulder to shoulder, breath thick with kerosene heat, waiting to hear what the book revealed. The judge lifted it with gloved hands, as though even paper might carry contagion. He read aloud. The crowd stirred. A woman fainted. The miners shifted uneasily at the table, eyes fixed anywhere but on the pages. Their lawyer protested. These are nothing but scratchings, delirium of half-mad men. But the jury leaned forward, listening harder, as though the ledger spoke truth. The miners' mouths could not. The entries grew worse. One noted, a quarrel, knives drawn, blood spilled, not by nature, but by choice. Another described, cutting strips to carry, words so cold, the crowd hissed aloud. By the final pages, the ink faltered, letters jagged. The last entry read only, the eyes remain. 5 survivors, at least 3 dead, but the ledger hinted at more. And now, the miners' pact of silence collapsed completely. Each man turned suspicion on the others. One swore he had never held the knife. Another claimed he only ate after the fact, never partaking in killing. A third spat that the ledger had been planted, a trick by sheriff and jury alike. The courtroom reeked of sweat and kerosene. Voices rose until the gavel thundered, but the air itself had changed. No one believed the miners wholly anymore. Not the jury, not the crowd, not even each other. In the evenings, outside the courthouse, townsfolk gathered with torches. Some called for trial to end. Others called for rope immediately. A man shouted, "They butchered neighbors like cattle." A woman screamed back, "Starvation drove them." The square shook with argument, but beneath it pulsed the same dread. If hunger could unmake men once, it could again. The miners sat in cells that stank of straw and despair. Guards reported strange behavior. One muttered constantly, pacing as though measuring steps for escape. Another lay, motionless for hours, whispering prayers. The man who had confessed earlier scratched symbols on the wall slashes, repeating the same marks from the ledger until the stone was scarred white. Hardin confided in his diary. April 14th, 1874. Justice now tangled. They may hang, yet I cannot tell if guilt lies in every hand or only some. Ledger damns them, but hunger damns us all. The trial neared verdict. Jurors sat grim, their faces etched by weeks of testimony. When they filed out to deliberate, silence fell heavy as snow. Outside, townsfolk waited, torches hissing in the dark. The smell of pine smoke mixed with sweat, the texture of fear pressing against skin like frostbite. Hours passed. At last the jurors returned. Their verdict: guilty not of accident, but of deliberate killing to feed upon the dead. A sentence followed swiftly. 4 would hang. One, whose role seemed least proven, would serve years in prison. The miners' faces froze as the words sank in. Not relief, not fury. Only the hollow stillness of men whose choices had finally caught them. What would you have done, hearing that verdict? Would you have cheered for justice, or felt a hollow pang of pity for men consumed as much by hunger as by flesh? The gallows were built in the square, timbers rough, ropes thick. Townsfolk gathered, murmuring prayers, curses, or silence. On the appointed day, 4 figures mounted the scaffold, their breath plumed white in morning air. A preacher offered last rites. One miner lifted his chin and spat a single word: hungry. The trapdoors fell. The crowd gasped. The ropes creaked, heavy as judgment. The winter of death ended in spring, but its shadow stretched long. Families of victims grieved, though no full count could be made. Rumors whispered of other graves still hidden in gulches, of names never recorded. Some swore the ledger's last pages had been withheld, too terrible for public eyes. And even as ropes swung still, questions gnawed. Had all 5 been guilty, or had some merely followed, too weak to resist? Did the ledger capture truth, or the ravings of a man gone mad with hunger? These questions remained unanswered, hanging heavier than any rope, because as the crowd dispersed, snow melting into mud beneath their boots, another rumor began to circulate, one that suggested the story was not yet finished. Spring came late to Montana in 1874. The river swelled with meltwater, ice breaking loose and groaning like timbers under strain. The mountain smelled of wet stone, thawing pine, and decay finally freed from its frozen prison. Deer Lodge carried on with the rhythm of planting, trading, repairing. Yet beneath daily noise, the memory of the miners clung like a shadow too long to shake. The stakes now stretched beyond the courtroom. The hangings had delivered a verdict of law, but not of conscience. People asked whether justice had been done, or whether the rope had silenced truth too complex to measure. If hunger could transform neighbors into monsters, then no verdict could banish that possibility from the land. Sheriff Hardin found himself haunted by details that refused to settle. In his diary, he wrote, April 28th, gallows complete, 4 men gone, yet ledger unsettles me. Final pages torn. Why? Who carried them off? What names lost? He suspected someone had hidden part of the truth, perhaps to protect families, perhaps to shield accomplices, perhaps to bury sins too black for daylight. Whispers followed. Some swore more graves still lay scattered along the miners' route. Thaw waiting to reveal bones gnawed not by beasts, but by knives. Hunters claimed to find odd cuts on carcasses left in snow, marks that did not match animal teeth. Others muttered of footprints near the gulch long after the trial. as though someone still walked there at night, searching for something buried deeper than flesh. What would you have done, hearing those whispers in lamplight, knowing winter would come again and hunger with it? Would you have dismissed them as frontier gossip, or tightened your door against a fear that men, not wolves, might come clawing in the dark? The townsfolk coped in different ways. Some refused to eat meat for weeks, surviving on bread and potatoes. Others prayed harder at Sunday services, pastors thundering about sin in the wilderness. Children dared each other to sneak near the scaffold timbers, claiming you could still hear ropes creak in the wind. Yet the rumors did not stay contained. Newspapers embellished them. Eastern cities printing stories of Cannibal Gulch, of the winter of death. Illustrations showed wild-eyed men tearing flesh in blizzards, half-truths becoming spectacle. Investors hesitated to back mining ventures near the Little Blackfoot. Families debated leaving Montana altogether. The shadow of hunger stretched far beyond Deer Lodge. And then came the most unsettling tale of all. Weeks after the hangings, a trapper reported meeting a gaunt stranger along the Missouri, heading north. The man wore ragged boots, but carried a pouch strikingly similar to the ledger's binding. When asked his name, he muttered only, "I was spared." The trapper swore he saw scars on the man's hands, knife nicks healed white. But when pressed, he admitted whiskey might have colored his sight. The town dismissed it as fancy, yet the rumor spread anyway. Had one miner escaped the noose, hiding beneath another name? The winter of death. The phrase returned, whispered like a curse. Judge Conger, before leaving town, confessed to a clerk that the case proved less about men than about what hunger makes of them. His words, meant as reflection, were repeated as condemnation. By summer, miners avoided the gulch altogether. Cabins collapsed into moss, graves settled under wildflowers. Travelers claimed to hear voices at dusk, faint cries carried on wind through fir branches, like men still calling lots, long after their ropes had snapped taut. Some swore campfires flickered in the distance, though no one ever found ashes at dawn. And yet, life moved forward. Crops grew. Newcomers arrived, sometimes unaware of the tale, until locals warned them away from certain hills. But the story lingered in kitchens and saloons, each retelling sharpening dread. What would you have done if you had been there in 1874, snow closing in, stomach empty, companions faltering? Would you have chosen death with dignity or survival with horror? And if you survived, would you confess or carry the weight in silence forever? Those questions never found clear answers. They still hang like mist over Montana's peaks, because even today, in certain bars along the old frontier road, old men lower their voices to tell it again. How 5 miners walked out of the gulch, and only one truth followed. They say bones still lie hidden where thaw has not yet reached. They say the ledger's torn pages surface now and then, traded in whispers, proof that the story is not finished. And they say that on bitter winter nights, if you walk too near the Little Blackfoot, you can smell something sharp beneath the scent of pine smoke. Not animal, not wood, but the memory of hunger itself. Some stories never thaw. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.